Greetings, YouTube. Today we're looking at Brunelleschi's dome, how a Renaissance genius reinvented architecture by Ross King. And this is the story of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral and how it ended up with its fabulous dome. And here is a picture of said fabulous dome. To give you an idea of the scale that you're looking at here, these vertical windows right there, those long thin ones, they're 30 feet high. And that ball at the top, which is gold leafed, you can actually climb into if you have a ladder, but there's a walkway right here where tourists can go up and walk around and get an incredibly good view of the city of Florence. Excellent illustrations in this book, I should point out, though that is the only front cover and the back insert are the only color ones. This is a fascinating story of not just the man himself, Filippo Brunelleschi, and his genius and how he single-handedly solved the problem that the creators of the original design figured was pretty much going to have to be done by divine providence. But he was also a masterful engineer of construction equipment, and he was a vindictive bastard. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. Now, when the original plans were made for the cathedral, they built a model, and it was a large model, a model large enough that could actually hold services into it and use it as a chapel. So it was a big model. And at the scale it was made, though, the dome was quite achievable because it was a single shell dome. So again, it wasn't huge. But the dome that ended up being made, this church is over 300 feet high, and the dome spans like 128 feet, which was, and still is, the widest, the biggest brick and mortar dome that has ever been constructed. But when they made that model, and they marveled at its proportions and how beautiful it was, no one had any clue how to make a dome that big. And they just kind of hoped that when they got to the point in the church's construction where they had to start working on the dome, that someone would have figured it out by then. Well, luckily for them, someone did. They had a contest, and Filippo, which is how the author refers to him throughout the book, Filippo won the contest, and his model was predicted. But his rival, who he had actually been in competition with before in the past, ended up being the co-capamaestro of the project. So they put two men that had been lifelong competitors and nemesis to each other, or nemesi, in charge of construction together. That's a weird thing to do, but apparently the politics of Florence were rather Machiavellian, if you'll pardon the pun. And one of the things that he did in this to get the construction on its roll was he needed a new hoist, because the hoists of the time for moving heavy objects from the floor from the ground level up almost 170 feet at the time were very poorly constructed. Many of them used 6 oxen turning and walking in a circle, and if you wanted to reverse the thing, you actually, after you lifted the stone up, or the stones up to where they needed to go, and you unloaded them, you then had to unhitch all the oxen, which is not easy, turn them around, put them back in the harnesses, and then have them walk in the opposite direction. Very time consuming. It means that you may only get, 5 or 6 or 8 lifts in a day, and that's not a lot. So Filippo came up with the design that only required 2 oxen, and it had a a threaded portion of the shaft which allowed you to engage 2 different gears. And by doing this, you could engage the top gear, which allowed you to move the weight up. You then move the screw up, engaging the bottom gear, which is on the bottom of the platform. And now the oxen, moving in the same direction, could lower the object, or the harness. And then you start the whole process over again. So they were able to get lifts of like 10 to 13 minutes per lift. which was a marvel at the time, because otherwise you'd be doing them, at a tenth of that speed. On top of that, he also invented the crane at the top, because the hoist only went up and down. The crane at the top that then took the objects and put them where they needed to go for the construction of the dome itself, because that's a far more dynamic process than just going up and down. And his design was so wonderfully done that it lasted for 60 years. And in fact, it lasted into an era beyond his life where Leonardo da Vinci sketched it to record its complexity and its beauty and its design, and he ended up being given responsibility for its invention, which I'm sure he didn't argue against a whole lot. So the guy was a legitimate genius. He invented dozens of different shapes of bricks to help construct the dome. Bricks that were held both vertically and horizontally to act as locks to keep the dome together. And there actually isn't just one dome here. There's an inner and an outer dome, and there's an incredibly labyrinthine series of passages and such between these two domes. He used this herringbone brick pattern. So this whole dome was constructed without any internal support. There's no internal wooden support for building this dome. The dome was put together all by itself at the same time with 8 different teams working on this 8-sided dome. Unbelievable that he could pull this off. Of course, it also meant as they got closer to the top, they actually had to lay off masons because the space got smaller and smaller, and they needed fewer and fewer masons to do the job. But that's what happens. Now, as far as him being a vindictive bastard, this is kind of funny and intriguing. Someone slighted him on a social event. I believe it was because they didn't attend a public meal that Filippo had invited them to. So what did he do? He created what is quite possibly the most elaborate practical joke that I have ever heard of. While the man was going home from work one day, Filippo picked his lock and got it to his house. Now, he had been trained as a clockmaker, so he knew gears and things. Once he was inside this man's house, he barred the door. The man in question was named Manetto. Manetto came home, couldn't unlock his door, knocked, called in, and Filippo on the inside disguised his voice, mimicked Manetto's own voice, and told him to go away. Why are you trying to break into my house? Which somewhat shocked Manetto, who was taken aback. Goes to speak to his fellow Florentines, and all of them begin to address him as Matteo, another man that lives in Florence. 2 constables then arrest him for outstanding debts that had been accrued by Matteo. And one of the people involved in this whole thing was the great artist Donatello, who had been to be a friend of Filippo's. So the constables take Manetto, all the while calling him Matteo, to jail. All the people in the cell, all the men in the cell, refer to him as Matteo for the entire time he's there. The next day, Matteo's 2 actual brothers show up, bail him out of jail, and chastise him for his womanizing and gambling that got him thrown into prison. Something that Manetto had not actually ever done. They then took him home and had a large meal where everyone referred to him as Matteo. At this meal, Filippo drugs him. They carry him back to his actual house, put him in his bed with his feet at the headboard and his head at the footboard. He wakes up the next day to find his entire wood shop, because he was an ebony carver, had been reorganized. Not ransacked, not vandalized, had been entirely reorganized. And then Matteo and his 2 brothers show up at his door and say, Manetto, I had the strangest dream last night. Said, I dreamed that I was a wood carver, but when I woke up, my entire shop had been organized incorrectly, so I had to fix it. At which point, Manetto was convinced that he had spent the previous day living as Matteo, and Matteo had lived as him. Now, of course, this was all a joke. This was all just to embarrass this man. And in fact, it worked so well that Benedetto left Florence forever and moved to Hungary. Now, there was a little silver lining in this whole thing. Benedetto apparently did it very well for himself in Hungary and accrued a small fortune. But that's the kind of lengths that Filippo would go to if you pissed him off. He was not a man to mess with. So, this is a fascinating book full of interesting characters, lots of great technical information about Renaissance architecture, which I loved. A thoroughly good read. It's not a huge book, so it's not hard. It's written in a very approachable manner, and the characters are all interesting. So I definitely recommend this if you have any interest in history or architecture, or like me,